live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode The Empath. Another rather disappointing one. So the thing, there's kind of a series here in the middle of season 3 where the episodes are not particularly good. Part of that has to do with budgeting. Part of that has to do with because in season 3, Star Trek was moved to a really undesirable spot. Like, I think they were moved, I want to say they were moved to like Friday at 9 p.m., which just very few people in the late 60s were staying in on a Friday night to watch TV, let alone Star Trek. And the people who were staying in were not watching Star Trek. So they ran into all kinds of issues in the third season. That's why you have a series of kind of not very good episodes right in a row. So, I mean, Plato's Stepchildren is good, but if we go one back from that, we had the Thelosian Web, not a very good one. Skip over Plato's Stepchildren because it is actually quite good. We get to Winkham and I, not all that great, not as terrible, but not great. And then we get The Empath, not a good episode either. But The Empath is another one of those episodes. Actually, I didn't talk about this with the Thelosian Web, but that is one of those episodes where they clearly did not have budget for a set. So everything is basically shot on the Enterprise. Just one version of the Enterprise there is the Defiant. In The Empath, they do actually go down to a planet, Minara 2, but we basically don't see much of the planet. Mostly what we see is this underground chamber. We do see a bit of a deserted research station, but mostly what we see is this underground chamber. And it is a weirdly constructed underground chamber where there's a few sort of geometric-y type benches, and there's a lab set up a little bit, but mostly this is just a dark room. There they meet Gem. They name her Gem. She's mute, but she's the empath. And they meet two Vians. The Vians are an advanced species. They are conducting tests, but initially it is unclear exactly what the premise of the tests are. It is clear fairly early on that the previous occupants of the Federation research station have already died during these experiments. And so Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are not particularly keen on being a part of the experiments. They learn that Jem is an empath. Not only is she able to sense and even experience the emotions of others, but she is a complete empath. So Kirk initially has kind of a cut on his head, and she touches it, and the cut disappears from his head, appears on her head, and then heals very quickly. So she's able to take on the physical pain of others in order to heal them. But she then has to suffer the way that they're suffering. So the Vians basically do some torturing. They torture Kirk. Interestingly enough, when they torture Kirk, William Shatner is shirtless, but later when they torture McCoy, DeForest Kelley remains shirted. I think William Shatner just wanted to be shirtless on camera again. Anyway, so they torture Kirk, and then basically what we learn is that the Vians want Jem to prove that she has internalized the value of compassion and self-sacrifice, because this solar system's sun is going to Nova, which the Enterprise crew already knew. But the Vians have the power to save one species, and they want Jem to prove that her species is worthy of being saved. So they torture Kirk. She does, in fact, save his life by taking on his injuries, but she only does so after McCoy urges her to do so. They then torture McCoy basically to the point of death, and they have to... Basically, the test is meant to figure out whether Jem would be willing to give up her own life in order to save someone else's. That is how she proves that to them that her species is worthy of survival. Jem does attempt to do this. McCoy pushes her away because he does not want her to die for him. And the Vians are like, nope, doesn't count. She has to actually sacrifice herself, not just make the offer. Spock is able to break out of the emotion-driven prison that the Vians have put him in. And he gets hold of the Vians' devices that they use to exert their power. And Kirk then is basically like, no, you're wrong. She has completed the test. She wins. You lose. Let us go. So that's what we got there. So there's a couple of things here. One is the element of experimentation on sentient beings. Typically, nowadays, and the 60s, it was a bit more of a Wild West in terms of human experimentation. There were experiments, particularly psychological experiments, but also medical experiments that are now regarded as completely unethical, that were being done into the 70s at least. And so human experimentation was definitely a concern. There were older experiments that were more directly detrimental to this. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, for instance, in which a bunch of African-American men were infected with syphilis without their knowledge or consent, so that doctors could study ways to treat that disease. But then you look at things like the Stanford prison experiment, which I can't remember what year that was, but I want to say that was the early 70s. So, I mean, human experimentation was still definitely going on in often problematic and unethical ways. Today, in most of the world, at least in the US, Western Europe, the global north, and I think in most countries in the global south, there are ethical guidelines for how to treat human experimentation that are much more concerned with ensuring that human test subjects are not harmed in any way. We do still have animal experimentation, however, and this is a big ethical concern for a lot of people. Particularly medical testing is often still done on animals in ways that are very problematic, in part because these things risk being very damaging to the animal test subjects. And there's a more practical problem, which is that something that works a particular way in animals will not necessarily work a particular way in humans, so the testing may or may not be entirely reliable. But from an ethical perspective, there are huge, huge problems with running medical experiments that are potentially painful or disfiguring or even fatal on sentient beings. And that is essentially what the Vians do here. They are doing experiments on people not to learn about those human reactions, but to learn about Gem's response to the suffering of others. And that empath element brings us to the second major social justice concern I see in this episode, which is the potential damage of being excessively empathetic. Empathy is an extraordinarily desirable quality, generally speaking. People who are empathetic are more likely to make decisions that reflect a consciousness of other people's needs, other people's values, other people's concerns, etc., etc. They are more likely to act in considerate and careful ways, whereas people who are less empathetic are less likely to be considerate, are less likely to worry about how their actions may negatively impact others, and so on and so on. It is more antisocial, generally speaking, to be less empathetic. But highly empathetic people are often quite vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Because they are concerned for others, they're often less likely to take care of their own needs or foreground their own needs or even validate their own needs. We see this all the time. Narcissists, for instance, tend to gravitate toward empathetic people because empathetic people are easier to manipulate if you can convince them that they have done something or that they have some responsibility to benefit you or to make you more comfortable. And this is what narcissists tend to do. And so people who are highly empathetic can fall into that sort of manipulation because their natural desire is to ensure that others are comfortable and that others' needs are met. That can end up leading to them being exploited if the person who is interacting with that empathetic person does not have much empathy. And so what we get in this episode is a very direct exploitation of empathy, right? The Vians, their whole thing here is Gem must prove via self-sacrifice that her people are worthy of saving. It is not enough, the Vian says, for her to offer to sacrifice her life for McCoy. She has to actually do it. And that's an incredibly problematic position, because an empath's natural impulse, someone who's empathetic's natural impulse, is going to be to sacrifice themselves, to put the needs of others ahead of their own needs, and that can be very detrimental to them.